Before we begin, there's no need to remember anything. Simply relax your body and mind, slow your breathing, and let this tranquil tale gently carry you into slumber. We often hear tales of grand battles and dazzling heroes, but tonight we shall enter a story you thought you knew, its dusty unknown and less glorious side. Forget those embellished versions. Real life is profoundly arduous. Take your seat and let us begin. Stories often start with a person. Late summer 1976. The air in northern Zaire hung heavy and stifling, laden with the humid heat rising from the Congo River basin. This was the realm of deep green forests, dense jungles where in the rainy season the red earth transformed into rivers of mud. Here lay the small village of Yambuku in the Bamba district. At the village centre stood the Yambuku Mission Hospital, a few simple brick buildings run by Belgian nuns. In this world governed by ancient rhythms, it shone as a beacon of modern medicine, assisting births, treating malaria, welcoming new life. Yet its most frequent and ultimately deadliest service was the daily vaccination clinic villagers queue for vitamin and drug injections. As 4 nuns or assistants prepare needles for each person, the day's sole 5 glass syringes must be reused repeatedly. After each patient needles, receive only a cursory rinse in a basin of warm water, a frugal practice born of scarcity yet sowing the seeds of disaster. On the 26th of August, Mabalo Loela, the 44-year-old headmaster of the local missionary school, fell ill after consuming smoked antelope and monkey meat, common local fare, purchased en route. He appeared healthy at the time. A week later, on the 1st of September, he presented with severe headaches and high fever, believing himself to have malaria. The nuns administered anti-malarial drugs according to standard protocol, but the fever not only persisted but triggered a series of horrifying symptoms. He vomited, incessantly suffered torrential diarrhea, and his stools soon became streaked with bright red blood. His gums began to bleed and his eyeballs turned crimson from ruptured capillaries. His body seemed to be disintegrating from within. The nurses tending him watched in horror as his demeanour shifted from serene calm to agitated confusion. Mbalalo Loela passed away on the 8th of September, exactly 14 days after the onset of fever. His family performed the tribal rites of purification, preparing him for traditional burial. Unwittingly, in this final act of grief and devotion, they were wrapping themselves in the deadly virus. Within a week, those who'd cared for Mabalo fell ill. Sister Fermina, who had kept vigil at his bedside, the patient in the neighbouring cubicle, and the women who performed his burial rites. They poured into the mission hospital presenting identical symptoms. The same fever, the same headache, the same irreversible hemorrhagic shock. The disease spread with spiderweb-like cruelty, from Balalo to his family, from the hospital to other patients, those who had been injected with contaminated needles that had touched his skin, then from these patients to their families. This small clinic meant to heal the sick had become an engine of transmission, like a central pump propelling the plague towards the surrounding villages. The locals gave it a name, Yambuku disease. They watched loved ones collapse, bodies breaking down in ways they could not comprehend. Fear gradually turned to horror. Some locked themselves indoors, others fled into the forest seeking refuge from the invisible hunter. Belgian nuns trapped in the epidemic zone sent increasingly anxious radio messages. They spoke of the plague, reporting 17 staff members dead, including 2 nuns. Hospitals were no longer sanctuaries but graves. The Zairean government, led by the formidable yet elusive Mobutu Sese Seko, finally recognised this was no minor matter. He sealed off the entire Bambat district, isolating over 500 villages. No entry, no exit. Troops arrived to guard the blockade. Within this sealed zone, 500,000 people shared confinement with an invisible monster. The world, only just learning of the situation, could only watch and wait. The enigma of Yambuku was no longer a local tragedy. but a global threat brewing in Africa's heartland. Zaire's cries of alarm finally reached the quiet, clean corridors of the World Health Organization in Geneva and the Belgian Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp. A young Belgian scientist named Peter Piot, just 27 years old, was among the first to confront the source of this terror. Blood samples extracted from dying nuns were carefully sealed in blue thermos flasks and transported on a perilous journey from Kinshasa to the Antwerp laboratory under the powerful magnification of an electron microscope. Piot and his colleagues witnessed an unprecedented sight. Not bacteria nor known viruses like influenza or yellow fever, but something entirely different. Long filaments, some straight, others curved like the letter U or the bend of a shepherd's crook. As one scientist later remarked, they resembled spaghetti. These strangely shaped filaments possessed an almost elegant beauty, yet harboured a deadly threat. Researchers knew they were related to the Marburg virus, that had emerged in Germany 9 years earlier, but the specimen before them was clearly a new species, independent of any known viral lineage. Meanwhile, another similar sample arrived at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. Within the center's higher security biosafety level 4 laboratory virologist, Patricia Weber, confirmed the discovery. This was a novel filovirus. The higher security protocols were immediately activated. Virologists worldwide were gripped by both scientific fervour and profound dread. An international team rapidly assembled, a courageous squad of experts from Belgium, the United States, France and South Africa. Poised to fly into the epicentre of the outbreak. Leading them was CDC veteran virus hunter Dr. Carl Johnson, an expert well versed in the intricacies of pandemic response and the delicate interplay between science, politics and fear. They boarded a C-130 aircraft laden with equipment its hold crammed with tons of supplies. Plastic isolation suits, generators, microscopes and sterile materials. This mobile laboratory resembled an expeditionary force heading into battle against an invisible foe. When the plane touched down on the dirt runway at Bamba, the scorching heat contrasted sharply with the oppressive atmosphere of the sealed zone. They entered a world frozen in fear, streets devoid of people, villages silent as tombs. They established their base at the now empty Yangbuku Mission Hospital, unnaturally clean. The nuns who remained had scrubbed every surface before falling ill or being evacuated. Yet the spectre lingered everywhere. The team traversed wards where hundreds had collapsed weeks prior. Their mission comprised 3 parts: identifying the cause, studying transmission routes, and crucially breaking the chain of infection. Fieldwork proved arduous. Bulky protective suits became personal ovens in the tropical heat. They crisscrossed villages like medical detectives, tracing the virus's path through human contact. They drew blood from patients and survivors, meticulously documenting every contact history. Soon the local mortality pattern confirmed what had already been revealed. The missionary hospital was the primary source of transmission, a wildfire ignited by the repeated use of a handful of contaminated needles. Yet secondary transmission was the true fuel. Person-to-person spread through close contact with bodily fluids, particularly during traditional funeral rites. They mapped the epidemic, constructing family trees of infection, starkly revealing how a single patient could trigger a chain of deaths. Racing against time in high-risk environments with scarce supplies, even the slightest tear in a glove could prove fatal. Their very presence sparked suspicion. Local rumours swirled of foreign doctors spreading plague or stealing blood. They must navigate not only the fog of a deadly virus, but also a cultural chasm and a wasteland of suspicion. As the team implemented precise contact tracing and safe burial protocols, a quiet yet crucial debate unfolded. The virus required a name. Standard practice dictated naming new viruses after their place of discovery. Yambuku virus seemed the logical choice. Yet scientists led by Carl Johnson felt profound unease. They had witnessed the village's terror and suffering, seen the stigma already branding survivors and their families naming it. Yambuku would forever brand the village with the stigma of plague. It would become a permanent stain, a scar on the map, burdening the local people for generations. They were determined to avoid this outcome. Scrutinizing the map, they sought a nearby neutral geographical feature, an element belonging to the Earth itself, not to humankind. Their gaze fell upon a dark, winding line not far from the mission station, a tributary of the Congo River known locally in Lingala as the Legbara. It bore the French name Ebola on the map. How fitting the river surged, carrying all things away, both bestowing life and capable of destroying it. Though lacking an original name, it held profound meaning. Thus, with this small act of cartographic goodwill, they made their choice. The originator of the Yambuku mystery, that thread-like entity that had plunged the entire region into panic, would be revealed to the world as the Ebola virus. This name did not point to the source of shame, but rather draped it in a veil of care. Yet the story was far from concluded. Indeed, it unfolded in parallel. While global teams confronted terror in Zaire, another wholly independent event quietly emerged, some 500 miles north of the border in southern Sudan. The outbreaks remained utterly disconnected, isolated like twin fires ignited by separate lightning strikes within the same arid forest. This parallel horror commenced in late June 1976, a full 2 months before Mbalalo Loela's first fever. The setting was not a missionary hospital, but a workplace. The large cotton mill in the town of Nenzara. This company town, both a trading hub and labour centre, stood in stark contrast to the farm life of Yambuku. The first confirmed patient, identified only as YG, was a warehouse manager who worked year-round in the back rooms infested with bats. On the 27th of June, he developed a sudden high fever headache and chest pain, succumbing to the illness on the 6th of July. The diagnosis was malaria. Subsequently, his colleague PG fell ill, followed by another worker. The disease began spreading among the factory labourers. Unlike the rapid transmission driven by contaminated needles in Zaire, the spread in Zara appeared slower and more intimate, passing between workers sharing cramped quarters, spreading among colleagues drinking from the same cup, and spreading among labourers working side by side all day in the hot, dusty factory. Sudan's outbreak also exhibited distinctive characteristics. Though equally lethal, the severe hemorrhagic symptoms common in Zaire, profuse bleeding from every orifice, were relatively rare here. Instead, Sudanese patients suffered more from joint pain and swelling of the mouth and throat. This was a subtle yet crucial difference. The virus spread from the factory with an infected worker who sought treatment in the neighbouring town of Maridi. He was admitted to Maridi General Hospital, a larger facility, yet no better prepared for such outbreaks than the small missionary hospital in Yambuku. Medical staff lacking gloves and masks, and with no concept of isolation protocols, soon became infected themselves. Maridi Hospital thus became Sudan's second epicentre. The second major outbreak centre in Sudan, the virus swept through wards and medical staff at an alarming rate. Of the hospital's 230 staff, 76 became infected with 41 fatalities. Sudan's outbreak proved larger in scale and more widespread, and in some respects more insidious than Zaire's, infecting 284 people and claiming 153 lives, a mortality rate of 53%. Though lower than Zaire's near 90% fatality rate, scientists encountered a slightly different scenario. When a small WHO team finally arrived in Sudan in October, the outbreak was already waning. It had infected all accessible individuals. Doctors and epidemiologists investigating the outbreak witnessed scenes of chaos and exhaustion, tracing the chain of infection back from Maridi Hospital to the Nzara cotton factory. They ultimately identified the initial cluster of cases centered around warehouse manager YG only when Sudanese blood samples were tested and compared with Zaire specimens did the cold truth become fully apparent. The viruses were indeed homologous, both belonging to the Filoviridae family, identical in morphology under the electron microscope. Their genomes differed. They were cousins, not twins. The Zaire virus belonged to one lineage, the Sudan virus to another. They emerged independently in different countries and animal hosts, simultaneously striking two distinct human populations. This discovery held profound significance. The 1976 outbreak was neither an isolated incident nor a chance biological accident. This was a major discovery. The world had not merely encountered Ebola, but the entire Ebola virus family. The Zaire and Sudan outbreak set a terrifying precedent. They revealed this new adversary was not a solitary killer, but a predatory family lurking in nature poised to strike humanity from any location whenever the delicate boundary between humans and nature was breached. The dual nightmare born in 1976, emerging from a quiet missionary hospital and a bustling cotton mill, became humanity's rudimentary awareness of a threat that would recede yet never truly vanish. A river of blood would surge relentlessly through the years to come. After the fiery tempest of 1976, an eerie silence descended. For 17 years, save for a handful of specialized virology laboratories, the world scarcely remembered the name Ebola. The virus that had made such a startling debut on the global stage seemed to vanish, retreating from the news and burrowing into the earth's silent depths. Yet it was not utterly extinguished, leaving only faint echoes and scattered whispers in the shadows, signalling not its demise but its slumber. In 1977, a single case emerged in the Tanda region of Zaire. A woman who fell ill after receiving a vitamin injection at a local mission station. This was a faint yet direct echo of the Yambuku outbreak. Like a solitary ember swiftly extinguished amidst the conflagration, silence followed for another 2 years. In 1979, the virus returned to another of its birthplaces, southern Sudan. The homogeneous Sudan Ebola virus ravaged the town of Nzala once more, a community already devastated 3 years prior. The pattern of illness was chilling. Workers at the local cotton mill fell ill and the virus swiftly spread to the hospital, the amplifier of disease. But this time was different. The world, or at least that small corner dedicated to extinguishing the outbreak, had grown slightly wiser. The lessons of 1976, though imperfectly learned, were remembered. The global response was swifter. Seemingly simple concepts like isolation and barrier nursing were applied with greater urgency. This outbreak was smaller in scale. 34 confirmed cases, 22 deaths. While a tragedy for the affected families, it was but a minor footnote in the disease's chronicle. The virus tested the world's memory and found it just strong enough to prevent the first catastrophe from repeating. Then it vanished again. For a full decade, the jungle guarded its secret. The virus remained hidden, leaving scientists in sterile, high-containment laboratories to speculate. They debated its origins, its hiding place, that mysterious natural habitat. They knew it must lurk within some unknown organism silently awaiting the opportune moment, the chance encounter with humanity that would restart the cycle of transmission. They searched, but the jungle was vast, the list of potential hosts nearly infinite. They tested insects, rodents, primates, yet found nothing. The trail grew cold, leaving only a lingering dread, fear, the shadow that haunted those who knew the virus's power. This monster left no trace until 1989, when it knocked on a very different door. Not the mud brick huts of Central Africa, but the sterile concrete isolation building in Reston, Virginia. A quiet suburb mere inches from America's political heartland, operated by Hazleton Research Products, the facility was originally built to house primates, primarily macaques imported from the Philippines for medical research. In early October, 100 monkeys arrived. Within a month, they began dying. The rapidity of the deaths and the severity of the symptoms alarmed the facility's veterinarians. The monkeys exhibited enlarged spleens and congested intestines. The initial diagnosis pointed to the known dangerous pathogen, monkey hemorrhagic fever. Though this pathogen was previously confined to monkeys, the facility sent samples to the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRID, at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This facility has long been the military's frontline defense against biological threats. Within its Biosafety Level 3 laboratory, a civilian technician named Dan Dargard began examining tissue samples under a microscope. He identified a virus, but its morphology seemed unusual. For definitive confirmation, he transferred the samples to the electron microscopy laboratory overseen by virologist Tom Geisbert. Geisbert prepared the sample for high magnification microscopy. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The screen revealed long thread-like shepherd's crooks. He had only ever seen this morphology in textbooks and reference photographs. This was a filovirus, its shape identical to that of the Ebola virus. The discovery sent shockwaves through USAMRID. The alert level escalated rapidly. Geisbert's superior Peter Yarlings, a lifelong researcher of the world's deadliest viruses, confirmed the results. This was Ebola, or a pathogen highly similar to it. A quiet, orderly panic spread. The outbreak had not occurred in a remote African village, but in the suburbs of Washington. The virus lurked within a building utilizing commercial-grade air conditioning, surrounded by homes, schools and shopping centres. A logistical nightmare commenced. A highly classified joint operation was launched with the CDC and the Army working in tandem. The objective was stark and brutal: euthanize nearly 500 monkeys within the facility, thoroughly disinfect the entire building, and maintain complete secrecy from the public to prevent panic. Fully equipped Army biological protection teams, a classic image of modern plague containment, entered the Reston Monkey facility, iconic scenes of the outbreak. For days they worked in sweltering heat and foul odours, systematically euthanizing animals, bagging and sealing the carcasses, and chemically decontaminating every surface. The work was grim, silent and efficient. Meanwhile, another fear gripped the scientists. 4 animal keepers at the Reston facility had been exposed to the virus. The test results were perplexing. Their bodies had produced antibodies against the virus. Their immune systems had recognised and successfully fought off the pathogen, yet none had fallen ill, not even a fever or headache. This became a profound scientific enigma. The pathogen they named Reston Ebola virus was clearly a novel strain, devastating to monkeys with a lethality comparable to African variants, yet for some reason almost entirely harmless to humans. This monster had landed on American soil, breached the protective barriers, yet strangely shrugged and departed. This biological alert ultimately proved a false alarm, a rehearsal for a catastrophe that never materialized. Yet the incident served as a stark reminder. In the modern world, deadly pathogens can travel the globe with alarming ease in the cargo holds of aeroplanes. It also added a new layer to the central enigma. There exists not just one Ebola virus, but multiple variants each, with distinct characteristics and varying degrees of virulence. The calm years ended, yet the questions grew deeper. The virus had proven its ubiquity, its family far larger and more complex than anyone imagined. Where did it lurk? When would it reveal itself again? When would its branches reappear? The world did not have to wait long for answers. After the Reston incident, the virus fell silent for several more years. Small outbreaks in Côte d'Ivoire in 1994 and Gabon were contained. These seemed like aftershocks, but were in fact the prelude. The true protagonist, the catastrophe that would forever etch Ebola into the global consciousness, began in the spring of 1995. This time, it was not a remote village, but Kikwit, a chaotic and booming city of 500,000 people in what was then Zaire. The story began, as so often, with an individual deep in the jungle. In January of that year, the 40- year, when a sole doctor was attending to a patient at his clinic, when the man suddenly collapsed. This was not a remote village, but Kik was a sprawling, chaotic metropolis within what was then Zaire. The narrative commenced with an individual deep in the jungle, a familiar opening. That same January, 40- year, minus old charcoal burning Gaspard, Menga fell ill while working in the woods outside Kikwit, suffering sudden high fever, bloody stools, and excruciating pain. His family rushed him to Kikwit General Hospital, an underfunded, overburdened institution in the midst of expansion. Lacking sophisticated diagnostic tool, doctors misdiagnosed him with dysentery or typhoid, common ailments in the region. Following Gaspard Menga's death, his family brought him home for burial according to traditional rites, including the ritual washing and touching of the corpse. This act of love and respect proved a fatal invitation to the filovirus. Soon after, the nurse who had cared for him, family members attending the funeral, and patients sharing his ward fell ill. The same terrifying symptoms followed in quick succession. The outbreak spread like wildfire throughout the entire hospital. This sanctuary, meant to heal the sick, became the epicenter of the epidemic, a conduit for its amplification. Medical staff fought in desperate conditions devoid of gloves, clean water, or basic protective gear, ultimately becoming the primary victims. Forced to reuse needles due to shortages, they inadvertently injected death sentences into subsequent patients after drawing blood. They cleaned the bodies of the sick and dying with bare hands, unaware the virus lurked in every drop of sweat, blood, and bodily fluid. An Italian nurse was among the earliest casualties, followed by a rapid cascade of collapses that swiftly decimated the medical workforce. Fear emptied wards more effectively than any lockdown order. By April, the situation spiraled out of control. Local authorities were overwhelmed, while the Congolese government's response was hampered by corruption and political turmoil. A local doctor contracted the virus through blood splatter while performing a caesarean section on an infected pregnant woman, succumbing to the disease days later. The virus was now spreading within the city, carried by grieving relatives and fleeing patients. It was a nightmarish scenario, a highly lethal and contagious virus rampaging through densely populated urban areas. Only then did the outside world take notice. Following reports from Médecins Sans Frontières MSF, the World Health Organization declared a major international emergency. The ensuing mobilization constituted one of the largest and most extraordinary deployments of medical and scientific resources in modern history. Teams from the Atlanta INES-based Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, France's Institut Pasteur, Belgium's Public Health Agency, South Africa's National Institute for Communicable Diseases, and MSF converged on Kigali. It was a race against time. Upon their arrival, the entire city was gripped by panic. Rumors swirled, some blamed witchcraft, others accused biological weapons. Corpses littered the streets, and Kikwit General Hospital lay deserted. Its remaining medical staff either fallen victim to the disease or fled in terror. The international team understood they must accomplish the tasks simultaneously, break the chain of transmission and earn the community's trust. The first step demanded rigorous, meticulous logistics. The second required more nuanced cultural communication and emotional resonance. At the heart of the plan was the isolation nursing mechanism, a concept simple in theory but challenging in practice, designed to erect a robust barrier between medical workers and the virus. led by senior experts including Pierre Rolland from the US CDC and David Heyman from the WHO. The team established new isolation wards within the hospital's sealed zone. All entrants must don spacesuit-like attire, waterproof isolation gowns, double or even triple -layered gloves, rubber boots, masks, and protective visors. In Zaire's tropical climate, the stifling heat inside these suits is suffocating. VCOs fog instantly, sweat pours down, and within minutes, the entire body is drenched. Every action from drawing blood to feeding patients water becomes slow, cautious, and mentally taxing. After each shift, they undergo a full body dousing with chlorine solution to eliminate the invisible enemy. The second phase of the plan involved contact tracing, pure detective work. Teams of local and international disease trackers dispersed across the city's sprawling neighborhoods. With each confirmed case, they must reconstruct the patient's recent movements over days or even weeks, who they lived with, who they worked alongside, who attended funerals. They then trace every contact, sometimes dozens per single case, and place them under 21 days observation. The virus's maximum and possible incubation period, the window within which the virus may incubate. This colossal socio-geographical mapping endeavor requires tracing invisible transmission pathways through a city gripped by panic. They go door to door, explaining and reassuring, taking temperatures, countering fear and superstition with patience and science. Simultaneously, another team shoulders the most perilous and culturally sensitive aspect of the outbreak: funerals. Traditional funeral customs were a primary driver of viral transmission. The Red Cross trained local volunteers into burial teams, instructing them in safety protocols and equipping them with protective gear. Often shunned by communities, these teams silently undertook the task of removing the deceased from home, disinfecting dwellings, and providing safe, dignified burials. They delivered vital public health services, yet many perceived them as violating sacred tradition. These unsung heroes, armed with chlorine sprays and body bags, confront the very heart of danger. Unlike the 1972 outbreak, the kit crisis unfolded under the global media spotlight. Satellite broadcast trucks stationed outside isolation wards transmitted harrowing footage to newsrooms in London, Tokyo, New York, and beyond. The world watched in stunned horror. Rescue workers clad in otherworldly protective suits, grieving families segregated at a distance, funeral teams working with quiet efficiency. These images became iconic, etching Ebola's reality into the global collective memory. It was no longer an abstract, distant disease in some corner of the world, but a clear and imminent threat, a harbinger of global plague. The approach began to show results, though the process was slow and arduous. The combined strategy of isolating patients, tracing contacts, and ensuring safe burials began to flatten the epidemic curve. New cases gradually declined as transmission chains were systematically severed. By July, the outbreak was declared over, with a cumulative total of 315 infections and 250 for deaths, a mortality rate of 80%. This constituted a triumph for public health, showcasing the courage of global responders. Yet this victory was hard-won, the lessons of Kitquit still ringing in our ears. It revealed that, in our increasingly interconnected world, an outbreak anywhere could spread globally. And the greatest question hanging in the air was more urgent than ever. While the global team could extinguish the blaze, no one knew where the fire had started. An outbreak anywhere could threaten the entire world, and the unresolved core question is more pressing than ever. While international teams can extinguish the blaze, no one knows where the fire started. The quest to find the virus's natural habitat, its hidden refuge, is about to begin in earnest. In the wake of the Kitquit incident, a new sense of urgency gripped the scientific community. Merely responding to outbreaks was no longer sufficient. Prediction, even prevention, was imperative. To achieve this, They must unravel Ebola's central enigma, where does it reside between its devastating assaults upon humanity? This question launched one of the greatest biological detective stories spanning the late 20th and early 21st centuries. This quest was not for a lost city or hidden treasure, but for the lair of a microscopic assassin, what scientists term the natural host. Such animal carriers can harbor pathogens long disturbed, often showing no symptoms themselves, becoming permanent reservoirs of the virus in nature. Identifying it would reveal why and how the virus sleeps into human population. This quest was a massive process of elimination. Scientists ventured deep into the forests of Central and West Africa, the so-called Ebola belt, to collect samples from every conceivable organism. Like viral prospectors, they sifted through the jungle's vast biodiversity in search of traces of the deadly spectre. They capture and test thousands of rodents, collect swarms of insects and spiders, grinding them into mixtures to detect viral RNA. Blood and tissue samples are taken from reptiles and amphibians. This work is slow, methodical, often frustrating, and conducted in some of the world's most remote and treacherous locations, establishing mobile laboratories deep within the Congolese rainforest, where electricity is intermittent and the humidity stifling, is a logistical feat in itself. Each sample requires hours of trekking through dense undergrowth, setting traps, and carefully handling animals that might theoretically harbor the target pathogen. For years, the results remained consistent, negative, no trace of the virus. Suspicions increasingly turned towards non-human primates. Gorillas and chimpanzees were confirmed susceptible to Ebola indeed. Large minor-scale mortalities among local ape populations, oft unpreceded human outbreaks. They served as canaries in the coal mine, the shrill cries signaling viral activity. Yet they could not be the virus's reservoir host. They succumbed to the disease as readily as humans, perhaps even more so. The ideal host does not die but coexists with the virus long term. These primates were fellow sufferers, not the ultimate source, another dead end in the hunt. Over time, a compelling new suspect emerged: bats. This hypothesis held strong ecological and virological rationale. As mammals, bats more readily serve as bridges for viral transmission to humans. As ancient creatures, they provided ample time for co-minus evolution. With viruses, their extraordinary immune systems are particularly adept at managing infections. Largely due to the metabolic demands of flight, a sustained low-grade fever state keeps the immune system hypervigilant, enabling it to control but not eliminate viral infections. Coupled with their tendency to congregate in dense cave colonies numbering in the million, they provide an ideal breeding ground for viral transmission and persistence. Their long-distance migratory capabilities further facilitate the spread of pathogens across entire regions. Bats embody every characteristic of the ideal reservoir host, though the challenge lies in proving it. The world of Terra. Scientists like French veterinarian and virologist Eric Leroy have dedicated their careers to this pursuit. Their expeditions become nocturnal operations, entering caves at dusk, or setting up large fine nets in forests, waiting patiently to gently capture bats as they emerge to forage. Each captured bat represented a minor triumph, carefully removed, identified by species, then sampled dural swabs, rectal swabs, minute blood samples from wing veins. This meticulous, precise work was often conducted deep in the jungle by the dim light of headlamps. Most bats were subsequently released and harmed back into the night. Years of exhausting exploration yielded tantalizing clues but never definitive proof. The team pursued critical indicators: antibodies against Ebola virus in bat blood signaling past infection and viral genetic material, RNA fragments, the holy grail, signifying current infection. In the early 1990s, Leroy's team and other researchers finally found their target. During outbreak investigations in Gabon, the Republic of the Congo, they captured thousands of bats across hundreds of species. within the blood of 3 specific fruit bat species. They discovered the long sought evidence. In the early 20th century, Leroy's team and other researchers finally made a breakthrough. During outbreak investigations in Gabon and the Republic of the Congo, they captured thousands of bats across hundreds of species. In the blood of 3 specific fruit bat species, the hammer-headed bat, the phrase in its fruit bat, and the lesser fruit that they detected Ebola antibodies. In a few bats, fragments of viral RNA were even detected. This marked a crucial breakthrough, though it fell short of the definitive proof they sought. They failed to directly isolate live, infectious Ebola virus from wild bat. This final piece of evidence remains elusive to this day, yet circumstantial evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates the killer's footprints across the bat immune system. They located the virus's hiding place not in soil, water sources, or mysterious insects, but dwelling in the skies. This discovery clearly outlines a potential spillover pathway, the virus circulating harmlessly within fruit bat populations, likely transmitted via saliva, urine, or feces. Humans may have become infected while hunting and butchering infected bats for bushmeat, a common practice across much of Central Africa. Yet, indirect transmission is more likely. Fruit-eating bats dropping leftover scraps onto forest floors, subsequently consumed by chimpanzees or antelopes. These animals, having become infected, were then hunted by humans, thus acting as bridges for the virus to jump from host to host. The virus subsequently transmitted from host to host. The first patient in the 1976 Ebola outbreak, Ebola, was confirmed to have purchased monkey meat at a local market. The first patient in the Kikwit outbreak, Gaspard Menge, was a charcoal burner who worked year-round in forests inhabited by bats. The index case of the 2014 West African epidemic -year, old boy is believed to have played near hollow trees harboring bat colonies. These connections are no longer conjecture, but credible chains of events grounded in scientific evidence. The quest to trace the virus's reservoir hosts represents a triumph of perseverance, a slow, arduous victory achieved not in hospital wards but deep within forests, where scientists wielded insect nets, swabs, and an unyielding resolve to unravel the mystery. This demonstrates that Ebola is not some extraterrestrial invader material ising from thin air, but an integral part of nature, an ancient companion that has evolved with humankind for millions of years. Outbreaks are not acts of malicious retribution, but biological accidents, misfortunes that befall us when the barriers separating the wild world from human society crumble. While understanding this truth does not diminish the virus's lethality, it transforms it from a mysterious supernatural monster into something that can be comprehended, tracked, and ultimately, perhaps, predicted. The quiet, systematic work of those tracking viral reservoirs has written a crucial chapter in preventing the next Ebola catastrophe. As the old millennium sighed its final breath, the new era arrived not amid cheers and fireworks, but in the creeping dread spreading across the red earth of northern Uganda. In the year 2000, the Gulu region lay ravaged by nearly 2 decades of brutal conflict waged by the Lord's Resistance Army. People no longer lived in their ancestral villages but huddled in ever-expanding camps for internally displaced persons, struggling in desperate poverty. Hundreds of thousands were rammed together by the war's brutal demands, their lives suspended in terror and uncertainty. This land had become the perfect petri dish. Something was growing. It first appeared as usual a mysterious strange illness, causing sudden high fever, unrelenting vomiting, and persistent diarrhea. Then came the bleeding. Local health officials, overwhelmed and under-resourced, initially suspected a particularly severe outbreak of Shigella, or cholera. Yet the death toll climbed at an alarming rate, with a chilling pattern of transmission. The virus spread like a curse within families. By October, the truth could no longer be concealed. Samples were sent for testing, and the spectre of 1976 reappeared. The diagnosis confirmed Ebola virus, specifically the Sudan strain, which carries a slightly lower fatality rate, but matches the Zaire strain intransmissibly. This was not merely an echo of history, but its most violent resurgence to date. The response resembled building a fortress in a storm. Chaotic, yet organized. The World Health Organization, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Medicine Sans Frontières rushed to Gulu, only to find the health care system hollowed out by years of war. Doctors were scarce, nurses even fewer, and the populace harbored deep, perhaps justified, suspicion towards any authority. The foremost task was monumental: constructing isolation wards. At St. Mary's Local Hospital, a Catholic mission hospital that had once been the region's medical backbone, wards were cleared. Plastic sheeting was nailed to 2 walls and hung before windows. These flimsy barriers meant to ward off an enemy invisible to the naked eye. Lines of bleach powder marked boundaries on the floor, this side the normal world, the other the high-minus risk zone. Logistics proved a nightmare. Contact tracing, a fundamental epidemic control measure, proved nearly impossible. How could one track displaced persons? They drifted between refugee camps and towns, perpetually on the move in their exile, seeking safety or sustenance. How could warm illness-ravaged families be expected to list every person they'd encountered over the past 3 weeks? Yet the medical teams persisted. Armed with clipboards, they traversed the camps, each question a gentle prod at unimaginable grief. They are mapping the virus's social network, striving gain the upper hand before its relentless spread. Work in the isolation wards resembles a slow, cautious ritual danced with death. In Uganda's sweltering heat, the protective gear, now famously termed PPIs, suffocating. Donning it is a ritual in its self-layering boots, 2 pairs of rubber gloves taped at the wrists, full minus bodysuits, aprons, masks, hoods, and goggles. Breathing becomes a deliberate act, vision reduced to a fogged up window. Nurses encased in bulky suits must perform the most delicate procedures, inserting iverses into dehydrated patients, cleaning bodies ravaged by bloody diarrhea, or simply handing a cup of water. These small acts of humanity carry cosmic stakes. Among the pandemic's heroes was Dr. Matthew Lugiuia, medical director at Losite Hospital. This courageous leader fought tirelessly on the front line, fully aware of the dangers, having witnessed too many nurses and colleagues fall ill. By early December, he too developed a persistent fever. He immediately self-isolated, knowing the protocols better than anyone. 5 days later, he passed away, his heroic battle ending in sacrifice. His death dealt a devastating blow to morale and starkly revealed the heavy toll humanity paid. When the Gulu outbreak was declared over in January 2001, it had left an indelible scar: 425 infected, 224 dead. It stood as the second deadliest Ebola epidemic in recorded history. It revealed that the virus could not only rage in remote jungles, but also spread through societies fractured by human conflict. This was a warning, an alarmingly clear one. In the years that followed, the front lines appeared calm, yet the virus never slept, it merely shifted its battleground. In 2007, the alarm sounded again, this time from the Bundabug-O district in western Uganda, a mountainous region bordering the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The outbreak reports were strikingly similar: a mysterious illness, high fever, hemorrhagic symptoms, and rapid death. Drawing on the painful lessons of the Gulu outbreak, an emergency response was immediately activated. Samples were collected for testing, now standard procedure. It was anticipated that this would again be the Sudan strain, or possibly Marburg virus. Yet the test results were perplexing. All known Ebola strains and Marburg virus tested negative. Yet patients were clearly succumbing to viral hemorrhagic fever. Global medical teams battled an invisible foe on the ground, treating patients, establishing isolation zones, conducting autopsies, all while remaining ignorant of their adversary's true nature. At the Gowan laboratory within Atlanta's CDC, virologists faced identical perplexity. Repeated tests yielded persistently negative results. This was no coincidence, but a genuine enigma. They therefore turned to the slow, meticulous work of gene sequencing, painstakingly mapping the viral genetic code from patient samples. Ultimately, they discovered it, a sequence clearly related to Ebola virus, yet distinct from the four unknown strains Zaire, Sudan, Reston, and the rare type forest virus. This marked the emergence of a fifth branch on the deadly family tree, a new relative announcing its presence to the world. Adhering to virology's straightforward geographical nomenclature, they named it Bundy bug Ebola virus. This discovery held profound scientific significance, yet was deeply unsettling. It confirmed that viruses are not static entities confined to a few known types, but rather an adaptable, evolving family of pathogens capable of generating new species and new threats that could emerge without warning from the depths of nature. This newly emerged Bundy bug strain carried a fatality rate of approximately 37% lower than its close relatives, yet chilling nonetheless. This monster could shift its form, and the forest shadows might harbor more unknown kin. The frontiers of fear were expanding. Uganda has become a brutal testing ground, a land that taught the world how to combat Ebola in war zones while revealing an adversary more cunning and mutable than anyone imagined. To comprehend this virus's rapid spread, we must step away from microscopes and isolation wards and enter the quiet sanctuaries of community mourning. The Ebola story transcends virology and public health. It is an anthropological, cultural, and love narrative specifically, a tale of how we bid farewell to the departed. Across many Western Central African cultures, death is not a cold medical event, but a rite of passage steeped in collective emotion and physical contact. The body of a loved one is not a discarded vessel, but a vessel bearing soul and memory, deserving one final profound care. This care is conveyed through touch. Imagine when a village matriarch passes, her daughters, sisters, nieces, and the women of the clan gather, preparing the deceased for her journey is their sacred duty and honor. They gently wash the body, a ritual of cleansing and reverence. They anoint the body with fragrant oils, clothe it in fine garments, and braid the hair. They take the hands and mouth, kiss the forehead, and whisper farewells. This is not a somber rite, but the highest expression of love, the final thread woven through a lifetime of familial bonds. The funeral itself is a communal ceremony, attended by the entire village to pay their respects. People will walk past the open coffin, touching the deceased one last time to convey connection and shared grief. The body may lie in state at the family home for several days, allowing relatives near and far to attend and bid farewell. Now the Ebola virus's life cycle is superimposed upon this ancient and beautiful scene. The virus is a master of tragic irony. As bodily functions collapse in life's final moments, viral load explodes. Every drop of bodily fluid harbors vast quantities of blood, vomit, diarrhea, sweat, tears. The instant of death and the hours that follow mark the human body's peak infectiousness, rendered essentially a pure vector of transmission. Thus, a ceremony meant to honor the deceased becomes the virus's most potent vehicle. The daughter's caressing wash transfers the virus from her mother's skin to her own. The farewell kiss becomes a death sentence. The entire village gathering around a single corpse to mourn transforms into a super-spreading event, a term now all too familiar to us. From this funeral, dozens of new chains of infection ignited, spreading like the roots of a giant poisonous tree. An ant carried the virus back to the village, a cousin to the city market. Each new chain of infection would culminate in another funeral within a week or two, another set of rights, and another community outbreak. It was a feedback loop by love itself. This posed an almost impossible challenge for the public health workers who came to combat the epidemic. Their directives shattered the most deeply held beliefs. Clad in unfamiliar, terrifying plastic protective suits, they resembled alien invaders, declaring you may not touch your mother, you may not wash your father's body, you must take the child away and place it in a plastic bag. To the community, this was not a medical necessity, but an act of profound disrespect, a trampling of their culture and humanity. They took not just the body, but the soul, denying the deceased the right to join their ancestors. Resistance surged like a tidal wave, its roots entirely understandable. Families hid the sick, fearing they would be sent to isolation wards to die alone. Their bodies never returned. They buried the dead in secret, digging hasty graves in backyards under cover of night to evade authority. The response teams, meanwhile, were seen as grave robbers, demons profiting from death. Rumors swirled organ theft, disease spreaders. This wall of mistrust proved far harder to breach than any logistical hurdle. When the very community you seek to protect views you as the enemy, combating the virus becomes impossible. The turning point came when public health groups realized the battle against culture must cease instead. We must learn to coexist with it. The goal was not to abolish rituals, but to adapt them to the new reality. Thus was born the concept of the safe and dignified funeral, a masterpiece of applied medical anthropology forged in crisis. Teams began collaborating rather than confronting community leaders, imams, priests, and village elders. They explained the science of mortality in clear, respectful terms. Instead of declaring your traditions are flawed, they explained current pandemic conditions pose risks to customary practices and proposed let us find new ways to honor the deceased while safeguarding the living. The new protocol was a compromise. Specialist funeral teams still handled remains in full protective gear, but with complete transparency. They visited bereaved homes to detail each step. The body would be placed in a sealed body bag, which relatives could observe from a safe distance. Before sealing, family members could place photographs or personal clothing inside. The team could recite prayers or arrange for religious leaders to conduct ceremonies from a distance. Families may gather at the graveside to scatter the first handful of earth upon the coffin in a vital element of mourning ritual. Though not traditional, it serves as a clean alternative to intimate ceremonies. Yet this suffices. It affords a measure of farewell, demonstrates respect, and crucially breaks the chain of viral transmission. Such safe, dignified burials became one of the most effective tools in ending the Ebola epidemic. It demonstrated that destroying a community spirit cannot save lives, both must be safeguarded. Lessons drawn from these localized outbreaks in Central and Eastern Africa equipped the world with a sense of grim preparedness for the challenge ahead. It possessed operational guidelines and an understanding of the virus's cultural coinstances. But these guidelines were only applicable to a wildfire, not a conflagration engulfing the entire continent. At the close of 2013, in a forgotten, remote village, a single spark ignited a powder keg that had lain dormant for decades. This village, Melandu, lay hidden deep within the forested hills of southern Guinea, within the province of Guekdu. Here, shade minus dappled greenery and red earth dominate, where the borders of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia blur into one another. These are not rigid boundaries enforced by barbed wire and police presence, merely dotted lines on a map easily traversed by families, markets, and histories that long ago crossed these imagined frontiers. This bustling crossroads proved the perfect springboard for the epidemic. On an unspecified day in December 2013, a 2-year-old boy named Emil Wamu fell gravely ill. He developed a persistent high fever, suffered unrelenting vomiting, and passed terry stools. By 6 December, he had passed away. Virus tracing revealed that before his death, a meal often played beneath a hollow tree near his home. This tree harbored a colony of Angolan free-minor staled bat-say species confirmed as a potentially Ebola virus reservoir. Perhaps he came into contact with bat excrement, perhaps he caught and handled an infected bat. The truth remains unverifiable. The only certainty is that he became patient zero in the storm. A week later, his 3-year-old sister Philomenas succumbed to the disease, followed by their mother who was pregnant at the time and then their grandmother. The outbreak spread to the midwife who had delivered their mother, who in turn carried the virus back to her hometown. Each funeral brought fresh infections, like deadly flowers blooming silently, spreading through close-knit family and community networks, yet no one knew the cause. In this Ebola, untouched region, symptoms were mistaken for other, more common killers: cholera, loss of fever, even suspected anthrax. Faced with such a swift and deadly disease, people had no experience in coping. During the critical 3 months from December 2013 to February 2014, the virus spread like a spectre, hitching rides in taxis, clinging to motorcycles, becoming a silent passenger in the daily throng. It infiltrated market towns where traders from 3 nations gathered to exchange goods and news. It infected medical staff in rural clinics devoid of gloves, protective suits, and awareness of the peril they faced. These nurses and doctors, striving to save lives, ultimately became the epidemic's most tragic yet potent carriers. At the crossroads of market towns, where people traded goods and news, it infected healthcare workers in rural clinics devoid of gloves, protective suits, and any awareness of the encroaching peril. These nurses and doctors, striving to save lives, became the most tragic yet potent carriers of the outbreak. Treating patients, they themselves fell ill, only to be treated by colleagues, forging new chains of infection within places meant for healing. Descending upon this unprepared land was the Congo Ebola virus, first identified in 1976, the most lethal strain within its viral family, boasting a mortality rate reaching 90%. Guinea's Ministry of Health began receiving reports from the south concerning an unsettling, unidentified illness, yet the information was fragmented, the regions remote, and the system sluggish. This particular strain, the most deadly within its viral family, carried a fatality rate of up to 90%. Guinea's Ministry of Health began receiving reports of a startling, mysterious illness in the south, but the information was fragmented, the regions vast, and the system slow to respond. It was not until March that Médecins Sans Frontières responded to the mounting alarms, collecting samples for testing at a laboratory in Lyon, France. On 21 March 2014, the confirmation arrived at Ebola. By then, it was too late. The virus had long since breached village boundaries, having begun its rampage 3 months prior. Its first cross-border transmission had most likely already reached Sierra Leone. The narrative centers on a highly respected traditional healer in the Kairouan district. When clinics proved helpless, Guinean families increasingly brought their sick relatives to her for treatment. Renowned for her miraculous healing abilities, she tragically contracted the virus during treatment. When she passed away, her funeral became a major event. Hundreds of people traveled from across the district to mourn the woman who had cured so many. They washed the body, touched the remains, and paid their respects, unwittingly carrying the virus back to their homes. This funeral is believed to have caused over 300 new Ebola cases in Sierra Leone. The virus's entry into Liberia was equally quiet and seemingly ordinary. A woman from Lofa County, bordering Guinea, crossed the border to visit a sick relative, contracted the virus, and returned home. She ultimately died in a small clinic in Liberia, infecting the medical staff who treated her. This healthcare worker then traveled to the capital, Monrovia, seeking better treatment at a larger hospital. He did not take an ambulance, but shared a taxi with others. This was the crucial difference. In all previous outbreaks from Yambuku to Gulu, the virus remained largely confined to rural areas. It raged in isolated villages, where its lethality combined with people's relatively static movement aided containment efforts. Yet now, for the first time, the Ebola virus is spreading into densely populated, impoverished urban centers. Cities like Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, and Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, both ravaged by over a decade of brutal civil war. Their public health systems are not merely weak, they have collapsed entirely. Liberia, population over 4 million, has merely 50-odd doctors. Hospital wards are dilapidated, perpetually water-starved, let alone possessing stable electricity or basic medical supply. This perfect storm weaves together multiple catastrophic factors. The deadliest virus strain infiltrated unprepared regions, accumulating staggering destructive power after 3 months of COVID spread. It converged at the heavily trafficked border zones, ultimately colliding with the post-war collapse of healthcare systems in 3 of the world's poorest nations. The wildfire had become a forest conflagration, sweeping towards densely populated urban centers, cities teeming with millions. The world would soon witness the terrifying dawn of West Africa's inferno. By summer 2014, the blaze had spiraled beyond control. What began as embers and hollow trees in Guinea's countryside has now become a catastrophe engulfing 3 nations. The number of cases has swelled from a trickle to a torrent. In Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia, the virus spread far faster than human capacity to respond. Official statistics were already horrifying, yet the true scale of the disaster remained vastly underreported. The reality whispered through villages where half the population had vanished and screamed in the crowded halls of makeshift clinics, where the sick lay on the floor, awaiting death. Social bonds frayed like thread. Markets closed. Farmers abandoned fields. Neighborly trust, familial ties, and the bond between citizen and state evaporated like morning mist under the scorching sun. Ebola ceased to be merely a medical crisis. It became a slow motions, societal collapse. For months, the world watched this tragedy with a detached, pitiable tragedy indeed, yet distant, as if unfolding on another shore. But viruses pay no heed to borders drawn on maps. In July, Patrick Sawyer, an infected Liberian American government official, boarded a flight with a high fever and vomiting, collapsing at Lagos Airport in Nigeria. This single journey in Lagos, a metropolis of 20-1 million, realized every disease tracker's nightmare. A regional conflagration was about to become a global inferno. The sluggish and complacent international community was finally jolted awake by primal fear. On 8 August 2014, Dr. Margaret Chan, Director-General of the World Health Organization, addressed the global media. Her carefully measured words carried immense weight as she declared the West African Ebola outbreak public health emergency of international concern PHEIC. This bureaucratic jargon, though institutional parlance, was in essence a global cry for help. It was the planet's alarm bell, signaling that this was no longer a local issue manageable by a few brave doctors and NGOs, but a shared crisis for all humanity. The declaration rigged an unprecedented pandemic response mechanism. The alarm acknowledged that this was no longer a local problem solvable by a handful of courageous doctors and NGOs. At this juncture, it is a crisis shared by all humanity. The declaration triggered an unprecedented pandemic response, overwhelming and chaotic, like the awakening of a slumbering colossus, yet unstoppable. Military forces from nations such as the United States and Britain were deployed not to combat human adversaries, but microscopic ones. Their mission was not combat, but logistical support. They were dispatched to erect hospitals across the globe. The U.S. military's Operation Joint Assistance dispatched uniformed engineers and logistics specialists to Liberia to construct dozens of Ebola treatment units CTUs. These were not gleaming modern hospitals, but sprawling complexes of white tents and plastic sheeting, meticulously arranged with geometric precision to control the flow of infection. Red zones for confirmed cases, yellow zones for suspected cases, green zones for healthy individuals. British forces arrived in Sierra Leone for a similar mission, erecting facilities and staffing them with medical personnel. The irony was palpable. Armies forged for destruction now performed desperate acts of guardianship. Their most potent weapons amounted to soap and a bucket of chlorine solution, yet the virus continued to breach their defenses. The sheer difficulty of operating in these nations is staggering. Already fragile supply chains have snapped entirely. Airlines refused to fly into affected zones, leaving them in near-minus total isolation. Delivering a box of gloves from a European warehouse to a rural Liberian clinic becomes a monumental task, requiring military transport aircraft to traverse collapsed roads and placate alarmed local officials. Billions in pledged funds remained unfulfilled, and the process of converting dollars in Geneva bank accounts into actual hospital beds in Monrovia was slow and agonizing. The true horror of this outbreak, distinct from previous ones, lay in its environment. Previous Ebola outbreaks occurred in remote villages, where the virus ravaged a community before exhausting its human hosts and retreating into the jungle. It was a tragedy on a miniature scale. But in 2014, Ebola took root for the first time in major capitals: Conakry in Guinea, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and most devastatingly, Monrovia in Liberia. Combating Ebola in densely populated cities riddled with slums presented an entirely different challenge. It was akin to attempting to extinguish a forest fire with a toy water pistol at the eye of a hurricane. In rural areas, where everyone knew each other, contact tracing, the process of tracking every person a patient had come into contact with, remained feasible. But in cities of millions, teeming with transient populations and strangers, it became virtually impossible. Patients shared taxis who were their fellow passengers. They bought food at markets. Whom did they brush past? It was within the anonymity of the city that the virus ran rampant. In areas like West Point slum in Monrovia, where 70-5,000 people were crammed onto a peninsula, living in corrugated iron shacks without clean water or sanitation. The epidemic spread at terrifying speed. Already widespread distrust of the government devolved into outright paranoia. Rumors proliferated. This was a government conspiracy, a Western plot to harvest organs. Those in strange white suits weren't here to help, but to take your loved ones to their deaths. When the government hastily and clumsily attempted to seal off West Point with barbed wire and armed soldiers, the community erupted in riots. Temporary shelters were overrun. Panic-suspected patients fled back into communities, carrying the virus with them. Poverty, fear and contagion coalesced into a perfect storm. Public health measures intended to contain the virus instead fueled its spread, for the currency of trust had been utterly debased. Fear then swept across the globe. In late September, Thomas Eric Duncan traveled from Liberia via Brussels and Washington, D.C. to Dallas, Texas. He had cared for an ill neighbor in Monrovia, but showed no symptoms during his journey. Days after arrival, he fell gravely ill and was ultimately diagnosed with Ebola. This nation, which had coldly observed the crisis through television screens, plunged into panic. News channels looped footage of protective minus-suited workers sanitizing his residence, transforming tranquil suburban streets into focal points of national anxiety. Two nurses who treated Duncan, Nina Pham and Amber Vinson, contracted the virus despite adhering to hospital protocols, with one having even traveled on a commercial flight before her diagnosis. The panic escalated into a political storm, with state governors demanding travel bans. Nina Pham and Amber Vinson contracted the virus despite following hospital protocols, one having even taken a commercial flight before her diagnosis. Fear morphed into a political tempest. prompting state governors to call for travel restrictions. Round minus the minus clock news coverage relentlessly amplified the story, magnifying the panic far beyond the actual risk. As cases emerged in Spain, Britain, and Germany, each new infection ignited wildfires of public dread. The world held its breath, fearing this invisible foe that had ravaged 3 African nations might consume us all. Yet at the storm's epicenter, within expanding quarantine zones on West Africa's sealed villages, a different narrative unfolded. This was not a tale of terror, but its very antithesis. Amidst the crumbling ruins of chaos, some did not flee the inferno, but confronted the flames head minus on. In the stifling, humid air of Monrovia, Freetown, and Conakry, heroes were not born in battle, but in sterile, chlorinated isolation zones. They were not soldiers bearing arms, but nurses clutching thermometers, doctors manipulating IV lines, gravidaires wielding shovels. The first and most numerous to step forward were local healthcare workers, Liberian nurses, Sierra Leonean doctors, Guinean ambulance drivers. They formed the first line of defense, yet bore the heaviest toll. They entered hospitals transformed into houses of bones, sustained only by courage and, increasingly scarce thin gloves. More acutely aware of the risks than anyone, they witnessed colleagues succumb to the disease one after another. They shared morning tea with dear friends, only to treat that same friend a week later in the Ebola ward. A week later, they would be digging that friend's grave. They understood the risks better than anyone, witnessing colleagues fall ill one after another, sharing tea with a friend this morning, treating that same friend in the Ebola ward a week later, and hearing of their friend's death a week after that. The psychological burden is unimaginable. Constant vigilance against any lapse that could prove fatal, a needle piercing the skin, a glove tearing, an accidental splash of bodily fluid, all potentially a death sentence. Dr. Sheikh Umar Khan, Sierra Leone's national hero and foremost virologist, had treated hundreds of Ebola patients. Though he knew the virus intimately, unpracticed with meticulous caution, he could not escape its grasp. His death, alongside hundreds of local healthcare workers, sent shockwaves of grief and dread through the medical community. Yet the following day, surviving colleagues donned protective gear and returned to duty. They had no choice, for what had perished were their homeland and their kin. Then there were the burial teams. In a culture where funeral rites hold profound significance, washing and touching the deceased represent the ultimate expression of love and respect. Here, Ebola unleashed its most brutal trick. The body attains peak infectivity immediately after death. Traditional funerals became biological bombs. To break the chain of transmission, bodies must be rendered safe. This sacred duty fell to teams of young men, often volunteers, frequently shunned by their communities. Clad in the harrowing white or yellow suits, they arrived at the homes of the departed to collect the bodies. Confronting grief-stricken families, they endure anger directed at them as grave robbers rather than saviors. They meticulously and systematically spray the body with chlorine, seal it within a double layered body bag, and transport it to an unknown crematorium or burial ground. They undertake one of the most critical tasks in combating the epidemic, breaking transmission at its most potent point. For this, they face so ostracism. Landlords evict them, vendors refuse to sell provision, and their own families shun them for fear of contagion. They are heroes no one dares touch. Global relief forces surge into this chaos. The Red Cross, WHO and national medical teams all join the fray. Yet the most conspicuous, most emblematic presence in this struggle belongs to Médecins Sans Frontières (MSF). Since Ebola's emergence, MSF has been engaged in combat. Veterans of this unique war, while the world debated the epidemic scale, MSF had already established the first treatment center locally. They possess a rigorous and efficient system for managing chaos. Isolation wards composed of prefabricated kits resemble boxed hospitals. They understand the virus's brutal logic. Decades of blood-soaked experience have forged ironclad protocols that border on cruelty. The ritual is a daunting procedure. For high-risks, ONS requires colleagues to assist one another. Each piece of protective gear is worn in precise sequence. Boots, inner gloves, dust suit, apron, mace, goggles, outer gloves with wrists and ankles taped secure, zips fully sealed. Entering the high-risk zone feels like stepping onto another planet. The outside world vanishes behind layers of plastic and rubber, leaving only the thunderous echo of one's own heavy breathing. A wave of heat instantly engulfs the body within minutes. Sweat soaks through the garments and fogs the goggles. Communication is possible only through loud shouts over masks or hand gestures. The internal mission is a race against time, not against the virus, but against one's own bodily functions. You might have an hour, 90 minutes at most, to complete your mission before dehydration and heat exhaustion turn you into a threat to yourself and your colleagues. Within that hour, you perform your duties, administering fluids, dispensing medication, cleaning up vomit and diarrhea, the telltale signs of the disease, holding a patient's hand, offering comfort through the distorted sound of the mask. But more often, you are merely a witness. You witness the human cost. You witness the terror in patients' eyes and the quiet dignity of the dying. The most perilous moment isn't entering the isolation zone, but exiting it. Removing protective gear is the highest risk phase. Every inch of fabric is treated as a contaminant, stripped with extreme caution to ensure the filthy outer layer never touches skin. Colleagues provide remote guidance, shouting instructions. Step into the first bucket. Spray. Remove the apron. Spray. Take off the outer gloves. Spray. It resembles a slow, deliberate dance, the inverse ritual of entry. Only when you finally shed the protective suit, standing drenched and exhausted in the clean zone, are you truly safe. After a brief rest with water, the cycle would repeat hours later. These local and international healthcare workers formed a fragile line of defense against the tide of infection. They could not save everyone. Indeed, in the early days of the outbreak, they could treat but a handful. Mortality rates in isolation wards often exceeded 70%. Their work was not about grand victories, but small acts of mercy. It was about providing patients with a dignified place to pass far from loved ones. Yet not alone. It was proof that in the face of a ruthless virus, humanity could still respond with compassion and courage. The brutal toll of this pandemic, the cost of this battle, and the sight of so many medical workers themselves becoming patients, laid bare a terrifying truth. Courage and disinfectant were woefully inadequate. Humanity requires more potent weapons. The terror of the 2014 outbreak catalyst, the most astonishing scientific sprint in modern history, the vaccine development race. For nearly 4 decades, vaccines remained theoretical dreams, existing only as low-priority projects in a handful of government and military laboratories. The reason's worst, archly pragmatic Ebola was a disease of the impoverished, confined to remote corners of Africa. Outbreaks were sporadic and self-limiting. For pharmaceutical companies, the economic incentive was non-existent. The market simply didn't exist. Developing a new vaccine is an extraordinarily costly and time-consuming process, often requiring over a decade and costing billions of dollars. Investing such vast sums to combat a disease that claimed hundreds of lives every few years in regions unable to afford treatment held no commercial value. Consequently, research stagnated, progressing as slowly as glacial movement. Promising vaccine candidates lay locked away in US and Canadian laboratories, their potential intact. Yet the West African outbreak fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Ebola ceased being merely a humanitarian tragedy and became a global security threat. This virus, capable of paralyzing air travel, destabilizing regions, and triggering panic in Western capitals, demanded an urgent solution. Funding surged from trickles to a torrent. Governments, charitable institutions like the Wellcome Trust, and pharmaceutical giants such as Merck and GlaxoSmithKline poured hundreds of millions of dollars into accelerating vaccine development. Dust mine as covered projects were retrieved from cold storage and advanced at a breathless speed, both astonishing and deeply frustrating to those who had invested years in the research. The world's attention was finally focused, but thousands had already perished. The leading candidate vaccine, RSV-GEBOV, exemplified global collaboration, initially developed by scientists at the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg, Canada. They ingeniously selected a common and relatively harmless farm animal virus, vesicular stomatitis, virus VSV, and genetically engineered it, excising one of its genes and replacing it with a key Ebola gene, the one encoding the Ebola virus surface glycoprotein. This created an ingenious biometicum, whilst incapable of causing Ebola infection. The vaccine deceives the immune system through its highly similar form, triggering a potent protective response. The Canadian government licensed this technology to US firm Novavax, which partnered with pharmaceutical giant Merck to advance the complex vaccine production and clinical trial process. Novavax, Inc., which subsequently partnered with pharmaceutical giant Merck to advance the complex processes of vaccine production and clinical trials. This accelerated pace gave rise to profound ethical dilemmas. How could experimental vaccines be tested safely and ethically amidst the raging, chaotic epidemic? The gold standard in medical research is the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, where some participants receive the actual vaccine while others receive a placebo, with neither participants nor doctors knowing the allocation until the trial concludes. This represents the most scientifically rigorous validation method. Yet when faced with Ebola patients experiencing their first exposure to the virus, gripped by terror, and knowing they face a 50% chance of a painful death, could one in good conscience administer saline solution, a placebo? The moral dilemma was agonizing, and most concluded it was not possible. A more flexible approach was urgently required. The answer lay in history, the successful campaign to eradicate smallpox decades earlier. This strategy, known as ring vaccination, employed a concept both simple and ingenious. Rather than attempting to vaccinate entire populations, it concentrated efforts with surgical precision. Upon identifying a new case, authorities not only treated the patient, but also urgently traced all recent contact family members, neighbors, dining companions. This formed the first line of defense. Subsequently, all contacts of these contacts were erased, forming a second line of defense. Vaccinating everyone within these containments zones created an immune barrier, establishing a fire break around the infection source to halt further spread. The flames were extinguished before they could become a raging inferno. In 2015, as the epidemic gradually subsided in Liberia and Sierra Leone, embers still smoldered within Guinea. It was in Guinea, along Guinea's coastal region, that the World Health Organization, in collaboration with Guinea's Ministry of Health, Medicines Sans Frontières and other organizations, launched the pivotal Ebola enough trial and operation that constituted a logistical marvel. Upon detecting new cases, mobile teams would arrive within hours. They navigated treacherous terrain, earned the trust of fearful and skeptical villagers, and meticulously mapped the social networks of infected individuals. Crucially, they transported vaccines requiring ultra-low temperatures of -80 degrees Celsius, demanding sophisticated portable refrigeration, and establishing an unbroken cold chain from European laboratories to remote Guinean huts. The trial employed a cluster, randomized design, ingeniously resolving ethical dilemmas. Entire communities were randomly assigned to either immediate vaccination or a 21-day delayed vaccination group. This ensured scientifically valid comparisons while guaranteeing all participants ultimately received the potentially life-saving vaccine. The results were astonishing. Data emerged not only faster than anticipated, but with certainty far exceeding all expectation. Among thousands who received the vaccine immediately, not a single person contracted Ebola, demonstrating 100% efficacy. The trial was halted early due to the overwhelming clarity and persuasiveness of the findings. The Data Safety Monitoring Board declared it unethical to continue withholding the vaccine from the delayed vaccination group. All participants would receive it immediately. This marked a monumental triumph for science and public health, kindling a beacon of hope amidst a tragedy-laden battle. The RSV vaccine, later named ARVAC, proved precisely the weapon they desperately needed. Though not a cure, it served as a formidable shield. Though this frantic race achieved victory, it came with a heavy footnote. The largest and most catastrophic Ebola outbreak in history, a catastrophe that claimed over 11,000 lives, ultimately propelled the promising vaccine across the finish line. The cure for this plague had lain dormant in cold storage. All along, it merely required the world to descend into flames before anyone finally retrieved it. The official end of the epidemic is a peculiar abstraction, a date on the calendar, a minister in a suit making a statement, and a collective sigh from the world. For West Africa in 2016, it was a weary celebration. The white tents could be taken down. The last international aid workers could board their flights home, and the insatiable news cycle could move on to the next topic. Yet for those who had traversed the inferno and survived by sheer luck, this declaration held no meaning. Viruses never adhere to official timetables. They write their own final chapter. In the ghostly silence of clinics emptied of nurses, in the muted despair of markets with nothing left to sell, the war ended. But the occupation had only just begun. For tens of thousands of survivors, victory is a complex product. They confronted a disease with terrifying fatality rates and prevailed, both a biological miracle and a feat of human resilience. Yet in the years that followed, many discovered Ebola and never fully relinquished its grip. What it left behind was a collection of cruel souvenirs, a suite of debilitating sequelae later termed post-Ebola syndrome. As if, in retreat, the virus had implanted ghostly pains and enduring shadows within their bodies. Survivors described burning joint pains that made walking torture, and bone-deep fatigue that sleep could not assuage. They spoke of headaches like a vice gripping their skull, and an eerie, persistent ringing in their ears. Yet the most terrifying legacy may be the virus's assault on the eyes. Many survivors developed uveitis, a severe inflammation within the eye causing blurred vision, excruciating pain, and even blindness. This discovery sent shivers through the medical community. The destruction wrought upon the eyes. Many survivors developed uveitis, a severe inflammation within the eye that not only blurs vision and causes excruciating pain, but may also lead to blindness. This discovery sent shivers through the medical community. American Dr. Ian Crozier, infected with the virus in Sierra Leone and subsequently treated at Emory University Hospital, became a chilling case study. Months after being declared virus-free, his left eye began to ache subtly, with persistent increases in intraocular pressure and gradually blurring vision. Most disturbingly, his iris, the colored part of the eye, began to change color, shifting from a clear blue to a cloudy green. After ophthalmologists cautiously extracted minute fluid samples from his eye, they discovered it teeming with active Ebola virus. This pathogen had found an immunologically privileged site, an area where the body's defenses are naturally weaker and laid dormant there. Like a secret prisoner, surviving long after the battle appeared to have ended. This discovery carries profound implications. It signifies that the virus can persist within survivors for months, or even years, hiding in bodily fluids, semen, cerebrospinous fluid, and aqueous humor. This is neither a zombie apocalypse scenario nor a case of The Walking Dead, but a complex public health reality. The virus lurking within survivors continues to exist long after the apparent defeat of the infection, lurking for months or even years in bodily fluids, semen, cerebrospinous fluid, and aqueous humor. This is not a zombie apocalypse script, nor a case of The Walking Dead, but a complex public health reality in extremely rare instances. Survivors may reignite transmission chains after the epidemic has been declared over. The hero's journey is abruptly tarnished by somber asterisks, yet physical scars are often more bearable than societal trauma. The survivor badge, meant as an honor, becomes a mark that divides individuals from their communities. In villages where entire families perished, lone survivors often face not sympathy but suspicion. Why them? What dark magic expired them? Fear, a pathogen more contagious than any virus, poisons the wellspring of community trust. Landlords evict survivor tenants. Employers refuse to rehire them. Friends cross the street to avoid handshakes. Children in school shun them. Those who endured the most profound suffering now became exiled specters, wandering ghosts in their own homeland. They stood as living monuments to trauma, while the community desperately sought to forget the pain. In nations ravaged by the virus, deep scars were etched not only on individuals but into the very fabric of society. The already fragile healthcare systems of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone collapsed entirely under the epidemic's weight. Countless doctors, nurses, and community health workers fell on the front line, perpetually exposed to the most dangerous currents. Clinics that once delivered babies and treated malaria now stood empty, their staff depleted and supplies exhausted. The intense focus on Ebola spawned devastating secondary crises. As the world poured resources into combating one disease, others claimed more lives. Measles outbreaks surged, malaria went untreated, and mothers perished in childbirth for lack of attendance. Healthcare systems were not merely overwhelmed, but utterly shattered. Their reconstruction will demand the efforts of an entire generation. The economy lay equally shattered. Quarantine and panic paralyzed markets. Travel restrictions severed livelihoods. Commercial activity ground to a halt. Farmers found no markets for their grain. Miners could not descend into pits. Fields lay fallow. The vibrant pulse of these nations had shrunk to a sluggish, feeble crawl. The cost of Ebola was not merely the death toll, but a regression in development. Precious years lost in the arduous climb toward prosperity. The West African outbreak taught the world a profound lesson, a bitter lesson in public health logistics. The final tally was disheartening, and all harbored a secret dread that new trials would come. This test arrived on 1 August 2018. The Democratic Republic of Congo's Ministry of Health issued a solemn statement confirming a renewed Ebola outbreak. Yet this time proved different. The outbreak did not emerge from the tranquil forests near the river that gave the virus its name, but from the nation's easternmost provinces of North Kivu and Ituri. This region had endured over 2 decades of persistent turmoil, with more than 100 armed groups entrenched within its borders. Government control was virtually non-existent, and the populace, having learned bitter lessons, harbored deep suspicion towards any uniformed personnel or official vehicles. With its uncanny ability to exploit societal fractures, the virus had chosen the perfect theater of war. Yet this time, the world was not caught unprepared. The 2014 catastrophe spurred a global scramble to develop urgently needed weapons. Now these weapons stood ready. Foremost among them was the vaccine, developed by the Public Health Agency of Canada, licensed to Merck Co., and fast streaked through clinical trials as the West African outbreak subsided. Dubbed the VEBO, this or VSVZ-EBOV vaccine stands as a marvel of modern science. Designed not for mass immunization, its genius lies in strategic deployment. The initiative, termed ring vaccination, employs a strategy that is simple in theory, yet profoundly complex upon identifying a new case. Response teams swiftly intervene, tracing every contact of the infected individual, family, friends, neighbors, bus companions, unvaccinating them. Subsequently, the contacts of these contacts are also vaccinated. This creates a ring of immunity, akin to erecting a biological fire wall around active cases to prevent the virus from finding new hosts and continuing its spread. It is like fighting a forest fire, not by dousing the entire woodland, but by precisely creating fire breaks ahead of the flames. In the chaotic conditions of North Kivu province, this is a monumental task. Contact tracers, often local community members, must traverse regions where fear and suspicion intertwine, asking deeply personal questions in villages where strangers may be perceived as threats. Vaccination teams, escorted for safety by United Nations peacekeepers, trek for hours along treacherous, muddy paths to reach isolated households in remote areas, carrying precious vaccine vials in specially designed cold chain boxes. They battle a microscopic foe in a landscape rife with macro-level dangers. Yet a new weapon has emerged for the first time: effective treatment. Standard care in West Africa was previously limited to supportive measures, intravenous fluids to combat dehydration, electrolyte replacement to sustain bodily functions, and prayer. It was a war of attrition, helping patients endure the viral onslaught in the hope of recovery. Now, however, there are antiviral treatments. The landmark PA LM trial Pomoyo to Lindimatia, meaning Together We Save Lives, conducted during the peak of the outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, stands as a marvel of research, ethics and logistical achievement. The trial tested for drugs, with two monoclonal antibody combinations proving highly effective in Maysby, later renamed. Developed by Regeneron, Hunter Bang, derived from a survivor of the 1995 Kirkwood outbreak. Both significantly boosted survival rates, particularly when administered early. The results were so conclusive that the trial was halted early, ensuring all patients received the life-saving treatment. This signaled a paradigm shift. Ebola was no longer an unstoppable death sentence, but was becoming a treatable disease. Community messaging transformed accordingly. From go to treatment centers to protect your family from infection to go to treatment centers because we can save your life. Survival rates soared to over 90% for patients seeking early care and receiving the new drugs. This represents a remarkable triumph in medical history. Yet this victory was won on the most challenging of battlefields, the epidemic response itself, plagued by the very mistrust it sought to dispel. Rumors spread like wildfire the outbreak was a hoax, a foreign plot to harvest organs, or a government scheme to undermine elections. This deep-seated mistrust was not irrational paranoia, but the inevitable consequence of generations subjected to violence and neglect. Rescue workers clad in protective gear and driving white Land Cruisers appeared daily and unterrifying. They were closely associated with an external world that had brought suffering yet offered little kindness. This suspicion ultimately erupted into violence between January 2018 and June 2020. Medical facilities and personnel involved in Ebola containment faced over 400 attacks. Treatment centers were burned to the ground, medical personnel were assaulted, abducted, and even murdered. In April 2019, Dr. Richard M. Uzokokibion, a Cameroonian disease surveillance expert and World Health Organization staff member, was shot dead during a meeting at Butembo Hospital. He had come to save lives, yet lost his own. The response strategy was compelled to shift from top-down, militarized operations to community collaboration. Anthropologists were brought in to assist. Shot dead during a meeting at Butembo Hospital, he He had come to save lives, yet lost his own. The pandemic response strategy had to be adjusted from top-down, militarized operations to community engagement. Anthropologists were brought in to help epidemic workers understand local customs and funeral tradition. Increasingly, the response was led by Congolese doctors and community leaders, who could bridge the trust gap in ways outsiders never could. They recognized that fighting the virus in conflict zones was equally about sociology, politics, and trust-building, not just virology and medicine. This 2-year struggle was brutal and exhausting. When the outbreak was declared over in June 2020, it had become the second largest Ebola epidemic in history, with nearly 500 confirmed cases and over 200 lives lost. This catastrophe showcased humanity's most advanced scientific tools while starkly exposing its most stubborn social failings. New responses emerged, yet they were steeped in blood. Thus we arrive at the present-day world still cast in the shadow of the epidemic. Ebola has not been vanquished, it has merely retreated temporarily to its silent silver lair, lying dormant within its unidentified animal reservoirs. Biding its time, the threat persists. Sporadic outbreaks persist, small and manageable in scale, yet still deadly for those infected. Guinea's 2021 resurgence, traced to survivors of the West African epidemic, vividly demonstrated the virus's tangible capacity for prolonged latency. Uganda faced a different challenge in 2020 to an outbreak of the Sudan strain of Ebola. This critical test revealed that the Democratic Republic of Congo's heroic vaccine, the exceptional of VSVC, EOV, proved effective only against the Zaire strain, offering no protection against Sudan. This chilling reminder underscores that Ebola is not a single pathogen, but a family of deadly viruses, against which we possess a shield for only one variant. Uganda ultimately contained the outbreak through traditional public health measures, rapid testing, rigorous contact tracing, and isolation. Yet this victory remains precarious. The current strategy against this enduring threat is perpetual vigilance, a silent war, fought not in emergency centers, but in national laboratories and remote health posts. The core lies in the surveillance system, strengthening primary health care capacity so that village clinic doctors can identify cases of unusual fever, safely collect samples, and conduct rapid testing, investing in gene sequencing technology so that scientists can decipher the virus's genetic code. When new cases emerge, they can almost instantly determine whether this is a novel zoonotic outbreak or a resurgence of a known transmission chain. Investing in gene sequencing technology, this powerful tool enables scientists to decipher viral genetic codes. When new cases emerge, they can almost instantly determine whether it represents a novel spillover from animals or a resurgence of a known transmission chain. Knowledge is power. It reshapes public health response models, guiding vaccination and contact tracing decisions with precision unimaginable a decade ago. The world has built a more robust early warning system. Institutions such as the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, born from the ashes of the 2014 crisis, now provide a framework for continental cooperation. The WHO's Emergency Response Reserve Fund can disperse funds within 24 hours of an alert, rather than waiting weeks for global donors to write checks. Response mechanisms are swifter, smarter, and better funded than ever before, yet alerts are only useful when someone listens and is prepared to act. Complacency remains the greatest enemy. This may well be Ebola's most profound and enduring legacy. From Yambuku in North Kivu, West Africa, to every corner of the globe, the hard-won lessons from this brutal battle against a deadly virus have become fundamental principles of modern pandemic preparedness. This brutal education in combating a terrifying virus taught the world how to confront other threats. The West African Ebola Response Manual has become foundational text for modern pandemic preparedness. This brutal and frenzied education in combating deadly viruses taught the world how to confront other threats. When the world faced the novel coronavirus in 2020, the reactivated operational guidelines were in many respects those developed during the Ebola outbreak. Contact tracing, a concept that became household during COVID-19 and S-19 was refined and professional, is aired in the towns and villages of Liberia and Sierra Leone. The Ebola outbreak starkly revealed the critical importance of clear, honest public health communication, while demonstrating that misinformation and political interference can lead to catastrophic consequences. Crucially, the unprecedented speed of COVID-19 vaccine development, shattering all scientific records, was built upon the foundations laid by Ebola vaccine research, global collaboration, novel vaccine platform technologies, streamlined regulatory pathways, and the establishment of institutions like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI. These innovations stemmed from the desperate global race against Ebola. That sense of urgency, that willingness to fund high-risk research, that recognition that a pathogen emerging anywhere constitutes a global threat, this mindset was forged in the crucible of Ebola. Ebola demonstrated with terrifying efficiency how a localized outbreak can escalate into a global catastrophe. It served as a dress rehearsal, an ultimate test for which we were unprepared and paid dearly. Yet precisely because of this, it equipped us with the tools, knowledge, and scars to confront even more formidable challenges. The virus remains in our world, a persistent, low-pitched hum of dread beneath the clamor of modern life. It reminds us how fragile human systems are, how thin the veil of order between healthy communities and crisis. It stands as a permanent mark, declaring that in the long, silent struggle between humankind and the microbial world, there is no final victory, only vigilance, only preparedness, only hope that when the alarm sounds again, we may remember the lessons learned in both storm and silence. When this tale of silence draws to a close, you need do nothing more. If you have already drifted into slumber, may this tranquility last the night. If you still lie awake, rest here until your heart is content.